Welcome. I'm Stanley Brubaker. I'm the director of our Institute for Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, and I am delighted to join forces with Bob Turner, director of the Division of the Social Sciences, and Link Johnson, the director of the Humanities, to present, and welcome you, and to present the first joint colloquium in living memory of the two divisions. So, anyway, welcome. Glad to see you. Perhaps no guest is more appropriate for such an event than Jonathan SHAY, author of Achilles in Vietnam and Odysseus in America. Dr. SHAY is a graduate of Harvard College. He's ABD'd, I guess you don't receive a degree, but he's ABD'd in sociology from Columbia University. He received his MD from the University of Pennsylvania, as well as a PhD in neuropathology from UPenn. He did residencies at Mass General and at New England Medical Center. He was assistant professor of pathology at Harvard Medical School, a fellow at Tufts Medical School. But the larger part of his career was spent as a staff psychiatrist, I should say, at the Department of Veteran Affairs. And there he came to realize that he could come to a better understanding of his patients through his understanding of Homer, and likewise a better understanding of Homer through his treatment of his patients, Vietnam veterans suffering post-traumatic stress syndrome. For his work, he was recognized with the 2007 MacArthur Genius Award, and I discovered he really is thoroughly a Mac man. He's got an iPad, an iPhone here, a laptop, so thoroughly Mac. Now, he treats Veterans Award. I have to say, this poster is a survivor of the print shop. It's got Thymos here. And spell-check caught it and corrected it to be Thymos. Why instead of Thymos? And he is a medical doctor, you know, so, okay. And then it was again corrected to be thyme, like the spice. Okay. But we got it through, finally, as Thymos. So the title is Why Study Thymos? Thymos, the spirited part of the human soul, what animates Achilles and may drive human history, but tends to be ignored in the social sciences. So here to tell us why we should study Thymos, Jonathan SHAY.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. I realize that I'm an absolutely shameless interdisciplinarian. I just rejoice at crossing disciplinary boundaries and kicking sacred cows along the way. And so I hope that I won't ruffle more feathers than I arouse interest. Anyhow, this term thumos, which Plato said was a third of every human soul, is really very much sort of out of fashion. It feels to most people like something that we've grown out of collectively or personally as mature adults. Since the classical Greek period, it's had a really turbulent reputation. There are some of us, and Frank Fukuyama is one of them, and others working in political sociology and political psychology, or others, have a real interest in putting this juicy Homeric word back into current philosophical circulation. And I hope that by the end of this talk, you'll at least be ready to think about adding it to your lexicon and actually maybe using it on occasion. It's a really oddball thing to want to do, because for Homer and for Plato, it seems to be something to do with killing rage, or at the very least with anger. Anybody who attends to this except to condemn it might well get suspected of being one of those intellectual chatterers that Thomas Mann so brilliantly mocked in his great novel Dr. Faustus, the kind of person whose eyes sparkle when they talk of violence. Whoa, great stuff. My interest in this comes from 20 years of clinical work as a psychiatrist with psychologically and morally injured combat veterans in the VA. I quickly learned that what took the greatest toll from their lives and those of their families, their workplaces, their communities, was traumatic damage to good character. And you will hear me bouncing back and forth between the word character and Thymos, and I hope that you will come away with an appreciation of how the semantic ranges that I'm playing with here really at least overlap a lot, if not turn out to be identical. Many of the veterans we worked with have been incarcerated. Many have led very violent lives since their return to civilian life. Their own violence had blighted their lives and the lives of their families. And I came to know that most of them hated their own bad behavior and suffered great humiliation when they looked at it. They could recall times that, and admittedly, the clinical population was self-selected, so very possibly it was self-selected for people who actually did recall time when they thought that virtue was possible, they thought that it mattered, and that maybe at one time in their lives they had actually attained it. But I can tell you that they were often a colossal pain in the ass in the clinic. They are inclined to demand constant honor and acknowledgement. They were often felt to be entitled, a blame word. They could frequently be heard to make self-important claims to have been players in not merely an important episode in the American war in Vietnam, but indeed in the most important events in all of human history. They wouldn't have phrased it that way, but the atmosphere around the claims sort of came across that way, the kind of thing that makes people want to use the word grandiose. They were very ready to take angry and even violent offense at what they considered to be slights to their dignity. Occasionally, they would refuse to deal with anybody but the head of the snake. This would either be the local head of the snake, which they misconstrued as being me because I was the MD on the clinical team. So what took them a while to figure out was there was no head of the snake, that we made all of our clinical decisions as a whole team, and that I didn't call the shots, and neither did Lisa Fisher or Jim Monroe, that it was a partnership. The destructiveness of their fantasies and wishes and occasionally behavior had a quality of sort of globalness, indiscriminate. In the Iliad at one point, and you'll forgive me if I've hung around with combat veterans way too long not to have a foul mouth when it seems worthwhile in getting the point across. At one point in the Iliad, after Achilles is morally injured by what happens in Iliad Book 1, he basically says, you can all fucking die. Patroclus and me alone are going to tear down the towers of Troy. You can, the rest of you can. So that's that kind of sweep of the arm is what people frequently use the term global as a qualifier for some motive or feeling or what have you. On the other side, everything I've described so far is quite energetic and so forth. They are subject to total collapses of morale, collapses of energy, to the point of being close to inert, unable to will anything. The Greek word euphulia, no will, has been applied to the collapsed phase of this kind of cast of mind, or whatever you want to call it. So, and also, and sort of strangely in the middle, is that they're also given to enormous hypochondriacal preoccupations and outright psychosomatic disorders, some of which are a little bit mysterious in what is the connection to what's going on in their spirit. Anyway, so in the clinic, this whole constellation was frequently swept all into a pile and pointed to narcissistic. And I expect everyone who inhabits this time and place is aware, the word narcissistic is almost always followed by something like bastard or son of a bitch, or that the word narcissism has been killed off as a scientific term, if it indeed ever could have had such a claim, although those few people who have an inclination to swim around these days in the psychoanalytic literature might recall the quite amazing, excellent writings of Heinz Kohut, one of the second generation of Germanophone psychoanalysts, a student of Freud who mainly ended up working in Chicago. But his book, The Analysis of the Self, is still very, very much worth reading. And I invite anyone who is inclined to do it to notice the weirdness represented in Kohut's book by the fact that he never once cites a philosopher. It is so transparent that he is using a whole vast range of philosophers. The only people he cites are psychoanalysts. He wants to show his credentials as completely orthodox within that community. And it's annoying, but in fact the work is quite useful and fascinating. So, I'm going to offer you an empirical, try and put some empirical bones, meat on the bones of this word thumos. As it was used in classical Athens, both by the philosophers and the tragic poets, Professor Amelie Rorty, who is a very fine Aristotle scholar, gave me this definition for that setting. Being a careful scholar, she said, I can't really address its use in Homer. I don't really know about that. But in the classical period, it meant the energy of spirited honor. Now, that's a good linguistic translation. The question is, how can we use that? And
Can you repeat it, please?
The energy of spirited honor. I want you to carry away the following empirical contents for thumos. It is the contents as culturally and socially constructed of a person's ideals, ambitions, and attachments. Ideals, ambitions, and attachments. Those of you who are familiar with Kohut will immediately say, oh, he's using Kohut. That's Kohut's riff on what the core of narcissism, both normal and healthy and deformed or pathological. So ideals, ambitions, and attachments. And then I would add a fourth term which has to do with the strength of energy that infuses these commitments. So the strength dimension applies individually and severally within this, and it's so now when you think about it, when you think about our word character, and I hope that this doesn't begin to swim together like the Tuscan bean soup we had at the faculty club for lunch, where there are just too many ingredients in the soup to keep track of them. That character, when we think about the word character, the concept of character, this is pretty much exactly what we would want in an empirical description of a person's character. What are their ideals, ambitions, and attachments, and how strongly are they energized? So someone might have all kinds of noble ideals, but ready to skitter away from them the moment they were even breathed on hard. We would say that person has a very nice character, but it's awfully weak. I notice that I'm being empirical here. I'm not trying to rule out anyone's having the right to judge another person's character. This is not a riff that says, oh, whatever floats your boat. That you don't ever lose your right to say, this is a vicious character. But I'm trying to give you handles to empirically describe what character might consist of. And a description that I submit could be transported to any cultural setting or historical setting. I have my own version of grandiosity, and that is that I really want to understand this amazing and terrible human critter as a phenomenon. So the question then that was presented in the clinic was, can the bad experiences of war damage good character? Can a person who made it out of childhood with good character be deformed into somebody vicious? And this is a deeply troubling question. It flies in the face of a long philosophic tradition that we can readily trace to Plato and through the Stoics and to Kant and to Freud, who admired both Kant and the Stoics. And that is the assertion that if you make it out of childhood with good character, Plato would have said with good breeding, in our terms, good genes, and good upbringing. If you make it out of childhood with good breeding and good upbringing, your good character, your attachment to virtue will set up like stone and cannot be budged, cannot even be chipped or damaged. Once you make it out of childhood with good character, you got it made. Well, that is the idea, and as I've already pointed out, it has a brilliant pedigree, and the trouble with it is that it's complete crap. And Plato's contemporaries, at least according to Martha Nussbaum, would have regarded this as the idea of a crank. And of course, the Athenian tragic poets would have regarded this as the idea of a crank. And in Achilles in Vietnam, I made the point, perhaps to a painful degree of detail, that the poet Homer presents the story of Achilles, who originally, prior to the events of Iliad Book 1, and the text gives us abundant evidence of this, prior to the events of Book 1, had a well-formed, mature, pro-social character that was quite thoroughly wrecked by simply what happened in that 10th year of the war, primarily through the misbehavior of his boss, Agamemnon. Let's, in this Tuscan bean soup, the next ingredient that I hope you won't get indigestion from is the term that I hope you will remember, and that term is moral injury. I have been working on this concept since the beginning of the Achilles in Vietnam project and right through everything else, and will continue if I ever do live long enough to complete the next book in the Greeky franchise, which will be on Athenian theater. But moral injury is what happens in anybody. And again, the grandiose hope that this might be something that could be said about any person in any culture. That if three things are present, one, a betrayal of what's right. That's as locally construed in that culture. We all have different linguistic codes across time and space and culture. And different cultures have different codes, ethical codes, that have some language-like characteristics of what is praiseworthy and blameworthy. So a betrayal of what's right as locally construed in that culture, number one, by someone who holds legitimate authority. Now, again, this varies a lot across cultures as to how elaborately institutionalized and formalized authority is. But again, every social system has some sort of concept of authority and some sort of concept of the sequence or processes or unfolding of legitimacy. So that's in the social system. And finally, so that's betrayal of what's right by someone in legitimate authority. Excuse me. In a high-stakes situation. Now, inevitably, the stakes in the situation are in the mind of the person who is morally injured. So you have this soldier and his closest comrade. They love each other in the way that people who have been through tough things together grow to love each other. And that love is in the minds of these two people. In the absence of that, it is not a high-stakes situation. If they really don't care about each other, if a person genuinely doesn't care about his buddy and the buddy is killed or maimed, then moral injury will not happen. It's also a way of pointing out that if the stakes are really low, so that if someone in legitimate authority betrays what's right by cheating at penny ante poker, it probably will not result in moral injury because the stakes are so low. So if all three are present, I assert that moral injury is present, and I invite you to do an extremely unpleasant thought experiment. It's ugly, but it should give you some greater interest in this concept. The thought experiment is this: to imagine for your own life situation a scenario that fits this description. 1, 2, 3. I won't repeat them, I know that you got it. If you imagine those three characteristics vividly for your own life situation, you will notice that your body is reacting. And I submit that you will probably notice that your body is reacting in the same way that it reacts to a direct threat from another person, a direct attack from another person. The body codes moral injury as physical attack. Now, the American Psychiatric Association basically sides with Plato and says that there's no such thing as post-traumatic personality deformity or disorder. It says it doesn't exist. Done. Well, okay. It's actually not okay. It's wrong. And it's interesting that around the world there's a much greater willingness to contemplate this. The World Health Organization's nosology system of diagnosis includes a category of persistent personality change after catastrophic experience. There's also a professor and his group in Berlin, Linden, who is working on an entity that he calls post-traumatic embitterment disorder. They have vast experience with the thousands and thousands of East Germans who believed that their life trajectory was clear and in their own view virtuous, and then with reunification, boom, they were shot out of the sky and they experienced a kind of social death and are deeply, deeply embittered and cynical, and there was no physical threat at any point. But so if I want you to, I hope, regard Thymos as an untainted terminological container that carries this burden. It may help to look at some of the other words. The Swedish scholar Ernst Arbman translated Thymos into German as die Ich-Seele. Die Ich-Seele. It's a very juicy term. The I soul, that which is most I, and that may help. The English, conventional English translation simply as spirit, I find totally opaque. Now, Thymos has a genealogy into the modern day that you can trace directly from Thymos to the term narcissism, and that tends to help us think that this is something that we really don't want to bother with and that is really obsolete and good to be done with it. But if you want to make sense of things like what's just happened in Tunisia and in Egypt and may happen tomorrow somewhere else in this grim world of the Middle East, grim for everybody but the tiny elites. The sense of being wronged, the sense of one's ideals and ambitions being constantly deteriorated, the sense of the people and the groups that one is attached to being constantly threatened. You begin to see the potential for killing rage and the potential for a state of which in the Iliad we see happen a few times of people losing all regard for their own safety, their own fate, and just being ready to go on a rampage. It's an interesting credit to the Egyptians that so far there have been no rampages, or only sort of some very tiny local rampages that were stopped pretty quickly. and God willing, there won't be any in the weeks and months that are coming. But the political spirit, this is, I believe, a term of art that does have a genealogical connection to the word Thymos. The political spirit is very much connected to this, what I claim is a universal feature of the human makeup. Now, the thymotic emotions, and what are the thymotic emotions? We've already talked about rage, probably enough. But rage is frequently the product, it is the product of the cognitive appraisal, a complex cognitive appraisal that my ideals, ambitions, and attachments are being very quickly and disastrously deteriorated. And what's more, it's that person or those people, the agency, the attribution of agency. So it's the combination of attribution of agency and the assessment that the commitments are being rapidly and severely deteriorated that produces rage. It's fascinating to observe that in the Iliad, when, first of all, Book 1 opens with a dual thunderclap of Agamemnon, the commander-in-chief, so to speak, of the expeditionary force. Dual thunderclap of two betrayals of what's right, bang, bang, one after another. The first being Agamemnon's horrible treatment of the priest of Apollo, who comes to the beachhead with abundant ransom for his daughter, who has been captured in a local raid by Achilles, actually, because all of the booty in the Greek camp is booty that Achilles has captured. But this captive girl was awarded to Agamemnon as his geros, as his prize of honor. And the girl's father comes to the beachhead and very humbly approaches Agamemnon with all this ransom and says, "Please, sir, ransom my daughter." And Agamemnon dismisses him in the most disgusting way. Again, forgive the crude talk, but the text of the Iliad is really crude here. He says basically, "Old man, I'm going to fuck your daughter cross-eyed, and you're never going to see her again, and get out of here, and if I ever see you around here again, I'm going to cut your throat." Well, we find this horrifying, but the fact is that the poet gives us the evidence that the troops find it horrifying. We hear the troops muttering, "Respect the priest, accept the ransom. Respect the priest, accept the ransom." Well, he's a priest of Apollo, and Apollo is, of course, the god not only of healing, but of plagues. And the priest prays to Apollo, and Apollo sends a plague on the Greek forces, and as the poet says, the funeral pyres burned day and night. The Greek army is devastated, and of course plague is the largest killer of soldiers throughout history, right up until the 20th century. So who is it that steps forward to figure out, to get a diagnosis and to find a treatment? It's Achilles. He cares about the whole army, not just his own troops, not just himself. But also, he and Agamemnon have a history. So to make a long story short, the next thunderclap of betrayal of what's right is when Agamemnon says to Achilles, well, if I have to give up my Geras, I'm going to take your Geras in compensation. Well, you may think that that's within his rights as a commander. Guess what? The text tells us it wasn't. In the course of the Iliad, the text has the other Greek officers say to Agamemnon, you shouldn't have done that. And the gods on Mount Olympus look down and say, nah, he shouldn't have done that. And eventually Agamemnon says, yeah, I shouldn't have done that. So the text makes it really clear that this was within that culture of a violation. Now, a modern example would be a current day infantry colonel who has in his battalion a sergeant who has the Medal of Honor and the Medal of Honor ribbon on his Class A tunic. And on parade, the colonel passes the sergeant, says, you have a Medal of Honor and I don't, and pulls the ribbon off his tunic and puts it on his own. I mean, make this translation. It's a pretty close translation of what happens in Iliad 1. People would say, this guy is nuts. He has no right to take that sergeant's Medal of Honor ribbon. He's not authorized to wear that ribbon. He hasn't been awarded it. And, I mean, it's a really crude violation of the norms for Agamemnon to seize Achilles' Geras. The typical high school teacher will spin this as a fight between two soldiers over a girl. And of course, there is some sort of body English, pun intended, attached to the fact that it is a woman, and at some points, Briseis is described as Achilles' spear bride, as his betrothed, to sort of, it appears rhetorically to be upping the ante for how much Agamemnon has wronged him, more than a deep, it may be a deep attachment to her as an individual. But it's really, what's really at stake here is honor. Oh, there we go. So that's reminding me that I want to have plenty of time for you to make comments, throw brickbats, ask questions, and so I'm going to wrap pretty quickly here. So you see that my grandiose ambitions aren't run out by a long shot, that the whole human critter, brain, mind, society, and culture are caught up in the definition of moral injury, or the observation of moral injury, if you wish. And I will probably just plain stop there and see what you have to say. I think I'm done. Thank you.
So you can probably field the questions better than I, so I'll just hand it over to you too. Okay, so we'll be happy to take your questions.
Yes.
I was wondering, you began at what I thought was going to be a list of demonic emotions.
Forgive me. Yes, indeed. So rage we mentioned, but when the appraisal of the situation is that one's commitments are rapidly and in a major way getting better, the ideals, and elation. Being boosted to the heavens is a thumatic emotion, for sure. And being slammed to the earth in abjection when one feels, it's the story of Job, lost everything. Well, I can tell you that there are National Guardsmen today, real Jobs, who come back from the current theater to discover that they have lost their house, been foreclosed. His wife has taken the children to her parents and said, go away. And no job. But the statutory protection for one's prior job turns out to be a very weak reed. So their whole social, it's a kind of social death. Such current theater veterans become, in their own eyes and in the eyes of many people around them, complete non-persons. And when one assesses one's ideals, ambitions, and attachments to be suddenly drastically deteriorated, they can be slammed to the earth. The military term for this, going back to the late 18th century, is nostalgia. It's a complete loss of any motivation, any self-care. In the military setting, it is usually fatal. In the concentration camps, this was known by the term Musulman, a misunderstanding of Islam, the idea that Muslims sort of passively accepted death without any effort to protect themselves at all. Strange idea. Anyway, but in the concentration camp, that kind of collapse of morale was rapidly fatal through various means. So the two ends of elate, to call one mania and the other depression, is a kind of weird tin ear for phenomenology, and that's a swamp that I don't want to wade into. So the social demand for respect and honor, I don't know that is exactly an emotion. It's more like an appetite. Sehnsucht nach Anerkennung was Hegel's term, a hunger for or longing for recognition. This is a complex mishmash of emotion and motivation and social moves, but it's very much in this territory of the thumatic emotions. Remember that Achilles is described at one point. Patroclus recalls his father saying to Patroclus before the two of them left for Troy, remember Achilles' megali thumos, has a large or giant thumos. Being acknowledged, honored, respected, sometimes this bleeds over into obeyed, so there's more, but at this moment I'm sort of drawing a blank. Kohut is very good on the phenomenology, and anyone who has an interest in this, I do not think you will feel your time has been wasted reading Kohut. You might want to skim some of the sort of the politically correct psychoanalytic chatter in the book and sort of read for the phenomenology. Others? Yes?
I think I have a question about what the main focus of your talk is. So let me. So
go for
it
it.
seems like there are more possibilities. I have more possibilities in mind, I think, than I saw traced out. We can think of ideals, attachments, and ambitions. Like so. Here's a sort of four-part typology or something. The ideals, attachments, and ambitions can be good and admirable, or the other, and a person's degree of commitment to those can be powerful or the other, giving us this four-part possibility, right? So are you just talking about the cases of people whose ideals, attachments, and ambitions are admirable and who are strongly committed to that?
No.
Okay.
Absolutely, that typology is intended to be as empirically descriptive as possible.
Because you also were talking about good character and attachment to virtue, which made me think you're talking about just one of those.
No,
okay.
no.
So,
I tried to, I realize in an unclear and stumbling way, I tried to make clear that, first of all, attachment to virtue was an invocation of the traditional, the philosophic tradition that we receive here. The stability of good character. Can good character be wrecked by experience, by bad experience? But trying to speak as a social scientist or a human scientist, whatever you want to call it, that I'm aiming to provide a bucket for an empirical description, which ought to be able to be operationalized if I imagine an attitude survey in the current setting. A good American meets his financial obligations. This is, of course, in the setting of so many people who are underwater on their mortgages and struggling to make their payments because they're unemployed. And so this would be sort of tapping the ideal that I hold for myself is that I meet my financial obligations. And what kind of person doesn't meet their obligations? And humiliation, forgive me, I forgot, a huge shame. Duh. How could I forget that one? Shame and humiliation are quintessential thumotic emotions. I am the kind of person who thinks out on his financial obligations. Yes?
I guess this is sort of following on David's question. If I'm understanding you correctly, what you've presented here is an argument in which you're saying the thing that gets damaged after a traumatic experience in war that includes betrayal of what's right, the death of the special karma, the thing that suffers the moral injury is the thumos. Is that correct?
There is a disturbance in the thumos, in the force.
And I guess following on what you said in this talk and what I've read in Achilles in Vietnam, this is your by articulating these concepts, you are trying to help us move away from the notion of post-traumatic stress disorder. Is that correct?
I absolutely abominate the current nosology, and I've been trying to blow it up for 15 years.
maybe articulate a little bit
Sure.
how the concept of thumos helps us see your critique of post-traumatic stress
Okay.
disorder?
That the moral dimension of trauma is systematically edited out of the official nosology. It's just out of order. You're not the thing that cannot be spoken of. In principle, one could be denied a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder if the thing that happened did not personally threaten your life. If I'm just trying to grasp the thread here. If what was lost was your social identity, if there was a kind of social death due to someone's, an example of a moral injury, which is, and I apologize, but in an academic setting, it sort of works as an example. You get an urgent call from the dean's secretary. The dean needs to see you in his office immediately. You go to the dean's office and puts his hand on a folder on his desk and says, in this folder is what appears to be evidence that your 3 most recent and best known papers are all based on fabricated data. And this example tends to work for academics in that everyone experiences a bit of a kick in the stomach, because it's all, of course, based on the presumption that this is a totally untrue accusation. But people will have frank flashbacks to that moment. The body codes this as physical danger and physical attack. I'm having a niggle that I've forgotten one important thread here.
I was asking about how thumos helps us understand the difference between your interpretation and what is conventionally classified as the
Okay.
state.
I just remembered and how could I have forgotten this piece? When one of the big, memorable, and clinically and socially and politically important features of moral injury is that it impairs or destroys a person's capacity for trust. Now, what happens when trust is destroyed? It's not replaced by nothing. The old saying, nature abhors a vacuum. I can't speak for physical nature and trust, but I can tell you that the vacuum is never left there empty. It is invariably filled by an active expectancy of harm, exploitation, or humiliation. When someone actively encounters other people or institutions or situations expecting harm, exploitation, or humiliation, this is a formidable barrier to them having any kind of flourishing human life. And also, the number of strategies that people have in coping with this are very limited. In general, the strategies are 3, and we see all 3 in the Homeric poems. One is strike first. Hit him before he can hit you. The second is run away and hide. And the third is deception, disguise, concealment, lying. And of course, that's a theme that runs heavily through the Odyssey. That Odysseus is the master scammer, the master liar. He even introduces himself to the Phaeacians as the person who's famous to the sky's rim for his scams. Whoa, what a way to introduce yourself. Interesting. Yes?
Yeah, it seems
both of you.
I go. Okay. So at the beginning of your talk, when you described your work with veterans, I thought you were talking about their humiliation. At one point, I thought you said that that humiliation would arise in them as they contemplated their own behavior. And then when you talked about moral injury at the end as a kind of betrayal of one's ideals or a violation of one's ideals, and you talked about Achilles. There, Achilles seems to be the agent of the violation and the betrayal. But I was wondering if that notion of moral injury is compatible with the case in which the subject himself has perpetrated some atrocity or something and thereby violated his ideals. So is the agent always external, or is it
No. You're quite right in pointing that out, and in fact, the term moral injury has surfaced recently in the psychological literature with exactly this meaning. A betrayal of what's right in a high-stakes situation where, full stop, qualification, the agent of the betrayal is understood to be the self. So, a horrible, horrible example of this, and the ethical philosophers address this under the heading, which I find rather opaque, moral luck. Bernard Williams and Martha Nussbaum have both discussed moral luck. But an example of atrocious moral luck, which has nobody's misbehavior, it's just something that war produces, is an example that was told to me as something that really happened at Fallujah, that there was a Marine Scout sniper supporting an engaged Marine infantry unit, and a very capable and well-concealed enemy sniper had taken down several Marines in this infantry unit. And the Marine Scout sniper finally located and identified this enemy sniper. And in his scope could see that he had a baby strapped to his front in what we would call a snuggling. And the Marine Scout sniper interpreted this in the most negative possible way, that he was using the baby as a human shield. But the law of land warfare and the rules of engagement and this Marine sniper's understanding of his duty and his loyalty to the other Marines he was supporting all said, fire this sniper up, and he did, and saw the round do its work. And this man will probably carry that as a moral injury for the rest of his life. Our junior enlisted men and women don't want to know themselves to be murderers. There's a very fine book, actually two books, which are unusual because they're the same war events through two different eyes and do two different roles. The first book is One Bullet Away by Nathaniel Fick. He was a Marine infantry platoon commander during both in Afghanistan and then in Iraq in the initial move from Kuwait to north of Baghdad and then back down to Baghdad. The companion book doesn't have anything in Afghanistan but covers the same Iraq fight by a journalist from Rolling Stone who was embedded with Nate's platoon. and wrote a book that I swear the publisher hung this lurid title on it, Generation Kill. It's not a sensationalistic book. It's a very good book, and it shows the same cast of characters and same events. And then what's fascinating is that both of these people are very clear that they saw the junior enlisted Marines as being very, very focused on not wanting to be murderers, but also wanting to be very skilled at killing the enemy, which they understood to be necessary. So I recommend both of those books together, but if you only read one, you won't feel you've wasted your time.
I'm going to ask a new one.
Oh,
but
go for it.
What you just said. That man who tragically killed that baby, and the person carrying it, is he actually in the same situation? As somebody who feels that moral outrage has been committed against him? It seems to me two different categories. It's not.
The moral injury, as I've described it, very frequently produces moral injury in this other sense. And I'll tell you another horrific anecdote. A patient of mine who was a Marine infantryman in Vietnam was put in charge of 17 disarmed and non-resisting Vietnamese prisoners. It was a Marine infantry fire team, which is to say 3 Marines, and he was the corporal. And as the sergeant was leaving the scene, he said over his shoulder to my patient, "We don't need no prisoners." And my patient understood this to be an instruction to kill them. And he proceeded to be the first person to open fire and discovered that the other Marines were reluctant to commit these murders, and he had to egg them on. And eventually they did join in the firing and the murdering. And what was so fascinating, painful and fascinating, was that, so to speak, the card that this man led with when he finally decided that he was ready to tell the clinical team, so to speak, the worst thing that he carried. The card he led with was, "I led them into sin." He had a very thorough and high-quality Roman Catholic parochial school education. And what weighed most heavily on him, he knew he was damned. Okay, I'm damned, but I led them into sin. That's unforgivable. I mean, that was what he couldn't forgive himself for. Now, the point here is that the order, as he understood it, to murder these non-resisting, disarmed prisoners was a betrayal of what's right in terms of the formal norms and, thank God, largely informal norms of the U.S. forces. Although I have personally witnessed some erosion of that. When I say personally, I shadowed an observer controller at the Joint Readiness Training Center at Fort Polk for a week and observed troopers from the 101st Airborne double tapping the wounded, double tapping being a euphemism for shooting the wounded. The first tap of the trigger being the round that wounded the wounded enemy, and then the second tap to kill him. When the wound, I mean, this is murder in everybody's book, but there was a pretty strong culture obviously generated by the leadership of this battalion, that we don't need no prisoners, and don't need any wounded prisoners especially, which are particularly burdensome.
As a clinician, what do you do? What's possible?
Well, the first thing is that you don't shut it down and shut it out. You don't disbelieve that such a thing is possible. There are so many horror stories of veterans being either just avoided or more destructive, called liars. That could never happen. You're making that up. And ultimately, the thing that works is community. I would say that it is flatly hopeless for one-on-one in a doctor's office, a clinical psychologist's office, etc., with the door closed, to resolve this. That only a stable and trustworthy community of peers seems to be a place where people can actually metabolize these toxins. I personally regard the dyadic default model of American mental health to be utterly bankrupt when it comes to combat veterans with psychological and moral injuries. Now, that's to many mental health clinicians, that's a deeply offensive position. Yeah.
Doesn't moral injury depend to some degree on the sense of innocence? That is to say, of gratuitous injury. And I was just wondering if this is the case, whether in protecting ourselves from this sense, we create a lack of innocence. That's to say, we become guilty of the offense which we would otherwise find offensive to us.
I'm having a little trouble following you because there are so many things that one encounters in the narratives of soldiers where they will say of something that somebody else did or ordered them to do, that ain't right. I don't myself encounter a very salient sense. I am blameless, and it's not right that he is ordering me to do that. It's sort of just directly, that ain't right. And I'm just not really connecting with the idea that moral injury in this sense requires a prior intense image and commitment to one's own innocence. I think it's sort of not on the table, so to speak, in many of these situations. It's just sort of not even considered.
I was thinking of Job and the sense of that one is in some ways deserving, although one doesn't know exactly how one deserves the suffering.
Well, the story of Job is rightly troubling to lots and lots of people who contemplate it. What exactly is happening when God appears to him in whatever it is, a storm cloud and a thunderclap or however, and basically says, I'm so much more powerful, and important and big than you are, so shut the fuck up. That's my spin on the end of the book of Job. And then there's gratuitously thrown in there that he gets back more children, more cattle, more wealth than he had before. And it sure leaves me not deeply. I mean, there's some great passages in Job that are memorable, but the overall outcome doesn't, to me, provide a whole lot of theological clarification or satisfaction. Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure with the concept of moral injury whether you've given us a powerful predictor or a description approaching tautology. I think you're saying that someone who has suffered an incident with these three characteristics will be morally injured. It will have an enduring change for the worse.
Well, will have a disturbance in their capacity for trust and in their thumotic economy.
This is what I wondered, because you are seeing, as a staff psychiatrist, you are seeing those people who have been injured.
Yes.
So maybe Plato was right most of the time, but you just didn't see it.
You're absolutely right that my clinical experience is highly, highly self-selected and institutionally selected, that it's not a random sample, and it is wildly difficult to let's take the claim, and there's real legitimacy to the claim that two people can be through the same traumatic experience and come out quite differently. And I believe this. I mean, there are physiological, psychological, social, and cultural factors that contribute, that are part of the ecology of every traumatic situation, that contribute to the outcome. Okay, what else is new? The same is true of broken bones on the ski slope. We know this. I accept this. I accept that there are differences in robustness and fragility between people. But it astonishes me the extent to which this is like a powerful magnet that just goes and grabs people's thoughts and attention. It's like saying, we just don't know why this person was so badly wrecked. And my preference is to point out that the term same and different are not transparent. In fact, I would claim that same and different are, in effect, an unsolved distinction in philosophy. That a conclusive way of saying that two things or two experiences are the same or different is a very troublesome one. But I want to give you and this is to some degree a hypothetical here. The one thing that's not hypothetical is my patient, who was one of two members of a tank platoon, 17 soldiers, where the 5-tank platoon was ambushed, and within 90 seconds all 5 tanks were rendered immovable and most of the soldiers killed. But 2 of the tankers were able to leave the battle site on their own 2 feet. Everyone else was either carried out as a litter case or dead. Now, My patient carried severe psychological injuries from a number of sources because he continued to do 4 tours in tanks. He had a lot of different traumas, but he doesn't know, and I don't know what happened to this other tanker who walked away from the site. But I will provide the following hypothetical. My patient witnessed the platoon commander, a lieutenant, platoon leader is the Army jargon, the platoon leader, nonsensically standing up in the cupola of his tank, throwing fragmentation grenades ahead of his own tank with no target that my patient could see. And then at some point he took a splinter from one of the grenades in his upper lip and called a medevac for himself and was medevaced. And this was about 2 hours before the ambush. So the lieutenant was out of there at the time of the ambush. And my patient interpreted this behavior at the time on the part of the lieutenant as cowardice, as basically shooting himself in the foot to get out of what the lieutenant was smart enough to recognize was a very ugly tactical situation. So, for the sake of argument, the other tanker did not witness this. They would not typically be operating in such a compact space that everybody in every tank could see everything happening on every other tank. So what the other tanker knew would be something that was same and different as the thing that we're exploring here. It's not the same, the knowledge. Then, a couple months later, my patient read in the division newspaper that this lieutenant had put himself in for a Bronze Star for the fight that he had not even been present at and had been awarded the Bronze Star for this battle. I mean, and that degree of capriciousness and fraud in the award of decorations, especially as between officers and enlisted men, still afflicts our forces and causes a great deal of bitterness. So, again, for the sake of argument, let's assume the other tanker never even looked at the divisional newspaper and never heard this or saw this. I mean, it's the kind of thing that could pass on. The lieutenants were rotated very frequently from one job to another and might have been out of the unit's life.
Well, it sounds like you have a falsifiable hypothesis here, but we just really haven't.
Yes, it's falsifiable, but the empirical difficulties are in when you're talking about real war.
Right.
In a laboratory situation, you can figure out falsifiable hypotheses for this. The trouble is that in a laboratory situation, it's hard to create this kind of thing, and ethically one wouldn't actually want to.
Right.
Yes.
I think you provide a really subtle and very important tool to our toolbox for understanding war. And I speak not as a pacifist, but as an anti-militarist, and I'm interested in the leverage that this subtle tool you give us can provide in terms of thinking about war more broadly. And I'm just wondering, I'm wondering about the larger narrative of heroism, and whether there, in your clinical experience, you see any valor that can redeem the character thus destroyed?
I was with you up to the very last sentence. I'm not sure what I would understand by valor that redeems a destroyed character.
Can an act of heroism, on a different occasion or in the same battle or the same moment in war, can an act of heroism redeem or undo, counter the damage, the kind of psychic, spiritual, social damage that you're describing? Because the narrative of war has it that heroism does that.
That's an interesting point. There are times when people feel so destroyed and so distraught that they are looking to die in battle. And since in actual battle the dice are constantly rolling, it is a world of randomness in which people who should have died repeatedly survive, and people who one would think would have been well out of harm's way die. And my discussion of the berserk phenomenon actually covers that fairly extensively in Achilles in Vietnam. So someone who really wants to die and is ready to die and doesn't care whether he dies may, just out of the sheer randomness of it all, survive. And I've had very few, but more than one patient who fit that description. And believe me, they have a rough time and they're somewhat bewildered. They continue often to want to die and feel like that they deserve to. And it may be construed by the military authorities as acts of heroism. Because what's a sure way to die? Charge a machine gun. That's a good way to get dead on an active battlefield. If there's an enemy machine gunner, run right up to it in plain view. But in the random world of war, people sometimes survive that. And it may be, especially if there are other soldiers who see what happened and use this as the opportunity to get closer and toss a grenade into that machine gun position, it may be interpreted as a coordinated and heroic act by this team, which may be the craziness, the insanity of real war is. I've never been there, but I've certainly gotten a flavor of it from the people that have. And one warrant officer, dust-off helicopter pilot, said to me, "It is so crazy that after a while you totally doubt everything in your senses and in your mind. That mountain over there, I don't think it was there yesterday. And is it going to be there tomorrow? I don't know." The chaos of war liquefies these things. In part, it liquefies it physiologically because there's so much extreme sleep deprivation. The sleep is fuel for the frontal lobes of the brain. The physiology there is absolutely clear. When you're out of gas in your frontal lobes, you cannot make cognitive frame shifts, you're incapable of ethical or emotional self-restraint, you become a moral moron. And this is one of my favorite hobby horses, and I'll spare you. I teach on a irregularly regular basis at the Chief of Naval Operations Strategic Studies Group at Norfolk, at Newport, Rhode Island. And the last time I was there, I spent a whole half day about sleep from the point of view of ethics. Who knew there was an ethics of sleep? It's a big time feed into people's ethical capacity. Ethics, leadership, of military policy, of military performance, of physiology. And I can tell you that none of those Navy captains or Marine colonels was asleep during that morning. They'd all been there, and they all saw the relevance of sleep discipline, sleep planning. Sleep is a logistical entity. It's used up and it needs to be resupplied. If you planned a 50-kilometer road march with your vehicles and only provided 25 kilometers worth of fuel, people would think you were crazy. But in the realm of sleep, people do that all the time. And they think it's virtuous. And several culture heroes, among them Socrates and Jesus, have very famous anecdotes, the point of which is, if you're really good, in all the meanings of the word good, you don't need sleep. So that famous one-liner that Jesus says in the Garden of Gethsemane, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, he's not talking about gluttony or sexual lust. He's talking about sleep. It's sleep that he's talking about. Holy cow. Anyway, other comments, questions?
I think we're really
okay.
out of time, but let me get one quickie. Sridhar, if you want to have a final question.
Yeah, I was going to ask the same thing about heroism, but I guess your answer raised another question in my mind as to whether you find, in your experience, there's some sort of a quid pro quo relationship between moral injury and physical injury. In that, if I run away from my platoon and then I get a leg blown up, can I now live with that and I wouldn't suffer moral injury? Like, is there a quid pro quo relationship?
In people's psychology, often they feel that they have paid for some failing or some something that an offense that they've committed by a serious physical wound. There's no question that some people see that connection in themselves. But it's a total myth, which floated around a lot, that the physically injured do not get psychological injury. This is completely unsupportable. You still hear that at times, but it's just unsupportable on a factual basis. They get the same range of psychological injuries. Is that a responsive answer?
Just in the degree of the moral injury, does the degree of your moral injury decrease if you've gotten some sort of physical injury for the wrongdoing committed?
I would think that if one is physically injured as a consequence of some leadership malpractice, that would double the rage and awfulness of the physical injury. But that's just my intuition. I have virtually no experience with veterans who carry major physical injuries. All of my patients were physically pretty much intact. So thank you so much for coming.